We're going to have a great panel with 3 superintendents who are knee deep in the work right now. We're going to drop their bios in the chat because if I read their bios, it would take the whole hour because they are lifelong educators. And there's between the 3 of them, there's over, I was trying to tally it up, like 150 years or something crazy. I was like, wow. And first we have Dr. Avis Williams, who is the superintendent in Selma City Schools, Selma. She led the district out of state intervention, increased graduation rates and achievement rates, and she was the Super of the Year for the Alabama Black School Educators Alliance. And I probably mixed that all up, but congratulations for that. There's a lot more you can learn about her and her bio, and we're happy to have you here with us today. And next we have Vivian Ekchain, who is the superintendent in Glendale. What I loved about your bios, when you talked about a firm believer in unparalleled power of education, and your commitment to education. And she's done lots of equity work and definitely a believer in the work she does for students. I couldn't even decide what to pick out of Dr. Hinojosa's over 4 decades of service in education. And I tried to figure it out and I actually couldn't, but because I know his work and we've been doing work, equity work in the past 10 years when I was a former superintendent. And what I love about Michael, and you'll see this if you watch anything going on in Dallas, he is deliberate and intentional about the work that he does for students and stands proud in what he believes at any cost. And my favorite line last week was, I'll pay the fine, and then folks chiming in. But I think it goes back to what we heard earlier. When you believe in what you believe, you either do the work, and then if it's not what you want to do, then you just got to go somewhere else and be at a place where they believe in that work. So that was the quick snapshot. We have 3 great sitting superintendents. And my name is Tracy Davis, and I am the former superintendent in Washoe County of 8 years and the new Department of Defense Director of Starbase, something like that. I can't even get the title right. But first graduate of the Urban Academy, and I want to shout out to a lot of folks from former academies at USC and Howard who are here coming back to share this day with us. Maria.
All right, thank you, Tracy. You really teed us up for a great panel discussion, and I really was impressed with the number of years that you said they bring to this discussion. So we have lots of questions and we realize the time is limited. We encourage people to please add your questions into the chat or any comments that you would like to share with our panelists. I'm going to kick off with the first question, and I'll take the panelists in the order in which they were introduced. So we'll start with Avis and then go to Vivian and then go to Mike. So our first question is that we continue to hear that the pandemic has widened the achievement and opportunity gaps for our students. You know, from your perspective, has the pandemic provided a new urgency that maybe this is an opportunity for all of us? And share with us how you are approaching this historic challenge and what opportunities you might see. So we'll start with Avis, then go to Vivian, and then go to Mike.
Yeah, so I would definitely say that the pandemic brought some things to light that I think we as educators and especially as leaders already knew. So in Selma, we are a very high poverty district, and most of our scholars are Black, and we've had challenges with student achievement for years. So the pandemic is not necessarily the cause of some of the challenges that I see from an academic standpoint, but it certainly did bring it to light for folks who were not as aware of it as me and my leadership team are. The one thing that I would say that has been of benefit for us is the additional funding that we're receiving. For us, it's an unprecedented amount of funds for a poor school district such as ours. And, we have a very robust strategic plan. And for once, we're able to actually fully fund our strategic plan by making sure that we're adding math coaches and having the necessary support for mental health and social workers and so forth that we were not able to do before. We always talk about the whole child, but in our reality was that there were so many limitations to the funding that we had that sometimes we were not doing as good a job as I feel like we will be able to do as we move forward. We have lots of things going on in terms of grant writing and partnerships with the community. And I do think that the pandemic helped deepen those partnerships because they were more necessary than ever. So it wasn't, again, anything new that we weren't doing before, but it certainly made a difference when the community saw the need for them to step up and to become a part of the team. Our theme is one team, one voice, committed to excellence. And we tell people all the time that the entire Selma community is a part of that team. And equity is one of our core values prior to the pandemic. So when we think about providing equity and removing barriers and providing access for all of our scholars, this pandemic has just given us a greater opportunity to be able to fund those things.
Thank you. Vivian.
So I think, as Ava said, the pandemic gave us a behind the curtain view of what was actually happening and really highlighted the gaps and opportunities that existed for our students. Coming from an asset accrued point of view, looking at post-pandemic, or as we're exiting, hopefully the pandemic, a restart, increased capacity in using technology for learning was definitely an asset that we were able to gain during this time. Greater family involvement, because whether we were ready for it or not, all families were more involved in this process and really understood what was happening in the classroom with their kids as a result of the use of technology and distance learning. And a deeper investment in expanded learning before school, after school, and being able to level the playing field with the resources that Avis mentioned, that we were able to bring kids in. We really never closed as a school district. We always had students on campus. And if it was for childcare or tech pods or expanded learning, we did not want to close the doors of our schools. And then lastly, opportunities for our students to become even more resilient and grow and become independent learners at the youngest age. So equity issues really were highlighted during this pandemic. And now it's our opportunity to innovate and definitely not go back to what we had before, but allow our next academic year. We're in our third day here in Glendale, California. It's exciting, I can share with you. The differences of opinion are tremendous because we are a diverse community, but pushing forward in what we've learned about what students are capable of and identifying the priorities around student learning and not necessarily thinking that everything that is in the framework must be taught at the same level of intensity has given our teachers also the autonomy to be more selective and use synchronous and asynchronous opportunities during the amount of time they have it for instruction.
Thank you, both Avis and Vivian. And now to our international famous superintendent over here, Mike. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, thank you all for having me. My internet's a little unstable, so if it starts going out, I may have to just take my turn my camera off. Thanks for the question. First of all, this is a unique opportunity for us to do some bold things that are very bold. In fact, we have 4 different calendars. We have one that's year round, one that's an intersession calendar. We have our traditional calendar. And next week, we're starting our virtual school that we had shut down because the state wouldn't give us dollars to do it. Now it's going to cost me $100 million, but we don't care. We'll take our ESSER dollars or our reserve to make it happen so that we can accelerate learning. And so all of that has been working well. That's just one strategy. We're also taking our 60 lowest performing schools and we're having school after school from 3 to 6 p.m. And the students don't get picked up till 6 p.m. And we're using some of our ESSER dollars to support that. And then we reinvented summer school and we called it Summer Breeze. And we did the Isley Brothers version of Summer Breeze, where our kids came all summer and we got them a lot more accelerated instruction. And we're also reinventing the school day. On the normal guided reading opportunities, we're going to take advantage of all this technology that we now have. We have technology, we have devices, we have curriculum, and we have staff that have been trained on how to use this. But the thing I'm the most proud of is we solved another problem, an equity issue. I asked a rhetorical question to my staff: why would I ever suspend a student again? And what I was expecting them to bring me back was a plan that if a student got in trouble, we would put them in a different place with the technology so they wouldn't be at home breaking into houses and getting in mischief. Instead, they brought me back a phenomenal program where by the way, let me tell you why this was so important to us. We only have 10% of our students are African-American males, yet they make up 51% of our suspensions. So that is just an indictment on our system. So what we've come back with now is we have reset centers, and we've completely redone in-school suspension and out-of-school suspension. And I was in a campus this week, and we've organized these rooms into a way where the students can decompress and change their behavior. And then we have asynchronous learning for them while they're there. So we have taken this opportunity not to ever go back to what we used to do and provide accelerated instruction and different instruction for our students. And we're the last industry to reinvent ourselves. And I don't want to be a taxi cab. I want to be an Uber.
I love that.
Thank you.
All right, Tracy.
Thank you. And I will take the same order so we're consistent. And my question is, in response to the pressure to address racial injustice in our schools and communities, what advice do you have for our Urban Academy participants as they lead their districts in addressing bias in our classroom and in our curriculum?
So I think the first thing is to know your community. Okay, so first of all, I'm in Alabama. And you don't get any redder than Alabama, okay, as it relates to the fear of critical race theory and the fear of all things that even remotely resemble equity in addressing racial bias. But I'm in Alabama, but I'm also in Selma, Alabama. Selma is a place that's the heartbeat of civil rights. So the things that we're able to do and say and address and the conversations that we're able to have in Selma probably look a lot different than the majority of the state of Alabama. But this is what I believe as educators, it is our job. It is our responsibility to fight for equity for all of our scholars. And just like our esteemed colleague, Michael Hinojosa is doing in terms of some of the fights that he's having to do, even as high up as the governor of his state, we have to do what's right for children. And sometimes it does mean that it doesn't align or fit with the general direction of leaders within your organization or within your state as a whole. For Selma, again, equity is one of our core values. And we mean removing barriers and providing access because we're such a homogeneous school district. I don't necessarily have what one would call racial achievement gaps within my school district. But what I do is I look at other school districts that have a different demographic than mine. And what I say is if it's good enough for Hoover, Alabama, it's good enough for Selma. And so, and that's across the board. That's across all measures and regardless of what aspect of education we're talking about. As it relates to conversations around racial equity and bias and that sort of thing, we do it as a community within my school district. I have a strong partnership with the Selma Center for Nonviolence, and they do a lot of work on restorative practices and working closely not only with law enforcement, but even with local businesses so that we're addressing biases through economic development and even through housing. And so partnerships, I think, are going to be the main way because none of us have to be lone rangers when it comes to this work. You've got a coalition right here, but even when you think about the work that you do in your own community, communities. You do have to find your allies, and you have to make sure that you are aligned with groups who are moving in the same direction for the good of children. And it doesn't mean that you can't have diverging thoughts, and it doesn't mean that everyone has to be completely in lockstep along the way. If you study what happened during the civil rights movement, there was a lot of dissension, but they had their eye on the prize. At the end of the day, everybody knew what the expected outcome was, which was rights that were equal and equitable for all people. And as leaders, that's what we have to focus on when we think about educating our scholars. And but again, you don't have to do it as a lone ranger. And if you're in a situation to where what you know is right is not necessarily the focus of your district or the focus of your community, then find your allies elsewhere, and just making sure that you are able to have the support that you need. And I know one of the questions later is about self-care. You know, when I think about the work of equity, I also think about the fact that we have to take care of ourselves through that work. And I think we do that by making sure that we have coalitions and allies so that we're not in the fight alone.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. And I love that eyes on your prize. Keep the eyes on the prize. Dr. Etching.
So 2 years ago, when I began my work in Glendale, it became very evident to me that there was an opportunity for us to educate ourselves. So leading and learning was the theme for the adults in my community that I introduced at the simple level of just having implicit bias training across the city, inviting our city leaders to be a participant of that, our community college leaders to be a participant of it, leveled the information field in terms of what opportunities existed for us that were the low-hanging fruit. And then, of course, diving clearly into the curriculum, having a curriculum audit take place for us to really recognize what type of resources our students had access to, being able to bring the conversation to a student voice panel and having our students communicate how they felt, looking at the data from the panorama survey of student engagement, and then being able to bring the data back to our educators, family, and community members and say which student groups felt engaged and which ones did not see a connection to the adults in the environment. Lots to be done still in our district, in our community. But the fact of the matter is that by forming a culturally relevant and responsive work group and opening it wide to anyone who wanted to join it, eliminated this understanding that only a few voices mattered and that we were elitist in our approach towards equity. So over 150 individuals joined that. We were able to then form 5 subgroups. And the reason I offer you the detail is even every group being able to accomplish one goal within the last year and a half gave us hope that the work can be done. And it's not just talking about it, but actually being able to monitor and measure progress towards that goal. And then the data of our students being over-identified for special needs, the data for our students on being college, career, and life ready, and being in a system where the equity dialogue was not common, allowed us as leaders and learners together to open the door to the more courageous conversations. And certainly the history of the city that I live in and that I lead in has not been one that we are proud of, but this is yet an opportunity to change immediately.
Thank you. And I love that you talked about student voice and the value of data-driven decisions as you make those decisions to move forward. Dr. Hinojosa.
Well, thank you. And this is a big issue. And, you know, we are all getting training on implicit bias. In fact, I'm doing my training today. I got to get it done before September 1, because on September 1, our critical race theory law goes into effect. Now, I started civil disobedience on this mass. I may just start civil disobedience on critical race theory, because I'm going to go testify at the Capitol next week in Austin, because now there's a special session to make it even worse for Texans. And I'm in a blue city, in a purple county, in a red state, and everybody is, I mean, this is incredible. The environment that's been created by our previous administration to create this kind of toxic environment regarding this topic. And so, you know me, I usually just try to blend in as Mort coached me, but sometimes I had to jump out there. And so, but I'm very proud of our district. In fact, part of my evaluation includes a percentage of our lowest performing student groups and how much we move the needle for them academically. That is part of our student outcome goals and part of the goal progress measures that we have for our student groups. And they can't learn if they're not in a context where they're understood and appreciated. So we're going to put up the good fight in a very red state. And so I'm starting that fight next week if Mort will take the handcuffs off.
We'll be there to bail you out. Well, one of the things building off of Tracy's great question and shifting us toward the impact that this pandemic has had on the well-being, both the social, it's not just physical, but it's the social, emotional well-being of everyone in your system. We were hoping you could share with us ways that you're confronting issues around trauma and mental health for all your groups, your students, your teachers, your administrators, and the families in your communities. What experiences and advice can you offer to our incoming and also our former participants? And we'll start with Dr. Williams and then go to Dr. Etienne and then to Dr. Hinojosa.
Yeah, no, Vivian brought up something important, the data points, and we use Panorama also. And that is a great way to assess with a true data point in terms of how not only engaged our scholars are, but also any problems that they're perceiving in terms of the relationships that they have at school and at home. So definitely using that as one of our data points as we make decisions. One thing that we have done is prioritize social and emotional learning. In our strategic plan that we started in 2018, we had an area called Culture, Climate, and Community. And within that area, we did address culture and climate within the schools and even in the homes in terms of what we can do through family engagement and that sort of thing. But part of that was finding a different way to measure it. You know, of course, we were doing our Elliott observations where we were looking at student engagement and, you know, classroom observations and counselors doing small group sessions where they were able to collect some qualitative as well as quantitative data. But the Panorama system has been extremely beneficial for us as an additional data point. And we address social and emotional learning through our entire school district, including our teachers, leaders, staff, as well as our scholars and the family. And so what we've done as we move forward, we are relaunching our strategic plan, and we've added an area called safety and wellness. And the safety piece includes physical and emotional safety. And the wellness is all about self-care, mindfulness. It's about making sure that we're taking care of our whole self, the whole child and our whole self from the standpoint of health and nutrition even. And we're even looking at yoga being added to our school curriculum as a feature. For our teachers, leaders, and staff, we prioritize self-care. I send a daily email out. Joy is one of our core values. I mentioned equity is a core value, so is excellence, but joy is one of our core values. And I send an email out every morning called Morning Joy, or Mojo for short. And on Wednesdays, that email is called Wellness Wednesday, and I give some wellness tips. And sometimes it's an article, sometimes it's some advice in terms of if they're interested in starting a new exercise program or changing their diet. And then our child psychologist will follow up with an email later with some specific wellness tips, and she keeps them in basically a wellness toolbox where they can go back and look at additional tips on wellness. All of our schools have self-care teams, and pre-pandemic, we started doing mobile self-care units where the central office team would go to each school with the self-care unit, set it up in their teacher's lounge, and provide duty-free lunch. And it was everything from, just some nice smelling scents, adult coloring books, massage chairs, and that type of thing. And so now moving forward 2 years from that, all of our schools have self-care rooms. and they are phenomenal. And you know, I threaten them sometimes, you know, do not be offended if you see me in your self-care room just lounging and chilling, because it's a great alternative to a teacher's lounge. And some of them have their meetings in there rather than having them in an auditorium or a media center or something of that nature. And another thing that we do is partnering with our community. We do have a parent university, and we are repurposing the position that used to be called parent facilitator to a family engagement specialist. And part of what that person will do is to ensure that we have some assessments that we're doing for our families to address, well, first of all, to identify any mental health problems and challenges and direct them to the proper services. We do have school-based mental health and partnerships where counseling is available, and we make it available on site in small groups for families, for individual students. And so it's a pretty comprehensive toolbox that we have in terms of strategies and opportunities. We also have an employee assistance program that we promote. You know, if any of our employees need to have mental health counseling or financial counseling or anything of that nature, they have access to free counseling that is confidential. One of our sub teams within our Safety and Wellness Project team has a initiative called Project SAFE, and SAFE stands for Student Advocacy Framework for Equity. And it's everything from advisory and mentorship to just making sure that we are using the data that we ascertain from Panorama and other sources to have a plan, an individualized plan, a wellness plan for every single student within our district.
Really comprehensive. I'll move it over to Vivian.
I'm amazed, Avis, at your wellness centers on each campus. Something else to do on my list of things that I need partners to engage with. I think what mattered the most when we began this journey together was understanding that we were all in the same storm, but not in the same boat. So families who were already historically challenged by a variety of factors had a completely different experience than those who were navigating through this pandemic with additional resources. So the very first step for that health and wellness was for us to be able to resource the families that did not have access to healthcare, did not have easy access to vaccinations eventually, to be able to form a healthcare partners group with 8 of our hospitals in our local area to engage them in supporting our families. So we weren't just by ourselves referring the students and their families, but also had these active partnerships and really embraced our families as a community rather than just as a school district. The next piece, from a student perspective, we already had restorative practices in all of our schools, but it changed dramatically as a result of this pandemic, because the adults who were supporting the students were now also worried about their own health and about their own families. So this restorative practices took a whole different approach when the entire community needed it. So from a specifics of offering childcare for our employees because they didn't know what to do with their own children when they were invited back to work, to signing up every employee who wanted to be vaccinated, literally signing them up and partnering with vaccinations on our own campuses, and now having COVID testing on each and every one of our campuses from 7:30 to 4 in the afternoon. The access and ease was a significant equity issue in our community, and there's a lot of hidden poverty. So being able to feed every child and every family without reservations or asking questions was yet another way of the health and wellness approach. Also, language matters. So when we had a categorical program department, we changed it to a family and equity engagement department. Our counseling became health and wellness, so that parents and community members and our own staff saw the whole child and the whole individual as a priority in this work, rather than looking at it in isolation by a specific behavior that was demonstrated. And then, of course, root cause analysis for what was happening to our students and being able to differentiate not just for their learning, but also for their social emotional support.
Thank you so much, Vivian. And Mike, we'll move it to you, and then we'll move on to a new question I think Tracy will have. But go ahead. Could you share what you're doing in this arena?
Yeah, please. Thank you very much. I'm going to go back to the previous question because I forgot to mention one thing. You got to do you, but it's not about you. That's what I tell young superintendents. You know, I'm proud to be an immigrant. I'm proud to be a Latino, but also militants don't get to stay at the table. So you can't scream and yell about everything. You have to pick and choose. And so I am picking and choosing this. So that's one thing, advice on the previous question. On this question, you know, I think we hired 58 mental health and social work professionals a year ago because we knew that when these students started coming back in person, they'd been around a kitchen table and there was one empty chair. Or, you know, the teachers are the ones that report the most violations to child protective services. And so we knew that there was going to be a lot of trauma and mental health trauma for our students. We're very lucky in Dallas because we're partners with Dallas County. We have school-based family and youth centers at most of our high schools, and they have mental health professionals. But also one of the other questions, which we'll probably not get to because we all talk too much, is about the SEL question. So we had gotten a $7 million grant from the Wallace, and we decided deliberately to train the adults first before we got to the students. But then we were in this research study with RAND, and of course they wanted us to have a treatment group, and you know, and so in a control group. And finally, we just said we threw that out the window because all of our kids needed all the SEL stuff. So this pandemic forced us to just push that and say, forget RAND, forget the research. And if Wallace, you want your $7 million back, we'll give it to you. But we got to take care of our kids. And so that's what we all do as educators. We pivot when there's a crisis and we try to take care of our families as quickly as we can.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, what a comprehensive perspective on issues that really are going to be so foundational to being able to get our students back and our families to restore the faith in us as, you know, our public schools have that faith that we're doing everything we can for them. And let me turn it back to Tracy. You're muted.
Thank you, Maria. I'm going to jump back. There's a question in the chat about civil disobedience. And while I'm asking all three of the panelists this question, Mike, this probably is more for you. How do superintendents reconcile their responsibility to follow the law of the land with what sometimes may be in direct conflict with what we know is best for the students we serve?
Yeah, let me start with that one, and thank you for that question. And not everybody's in the position that I'm in. I've been a superintendent for 27 years, and I'm a student in Dallas. I was a student in Dallas. I was a teacher in Dallas. I was superintendent in 3 suburban districts. So I have built, you know, a nice career here in Dallas, and so people know me. So I can take a few more liberties and take a few more chances than other people might be able to do. And that is a very thin line to stay on the right side of. You know, people say, well, the Supreme Court ruled that you couldn't enforce your mask mandate. I said, well, they said that about the county. They didn't say that about Dallas ISD. We're the Dallas Independent School District. We're not part of the county. So I'm looking at every little angle as to where I can keep that narrative going. And you have to be smart and you have to have good attorneys because I don't look good in stripes. So I don't want to go to jail. But sometimes you got to do what you got to do. Have y'all ever heard of Rosa Parks? How many times was Malcolm X arrested? How many times was Martin Luther King arrested? Why am I going to put my kids in harm's way when I know I'm going to put them in harm's way? So sometimes you have to be on the wrong side of the law. Now you have to be very strategic on how and when you do it. But, you know, so stay tuned. I mean, I may lose this, and will I be better off in trouble, or will I be better off in the seat? At some point, I have to make that decision. But as of right now, all these attorneys are helping me make that decision. And it's a very thin line. And so you just got to be careful what you're risking when you do cross that line, but you also cannot be afraid of your job. And I was a little disappointed in some of the superintendents in the county when they started backing off when this ruling came out from the Supreme Court and the Attorney General. And I'm not afraid of anybody. I'm just afraid of my wife. So I have to keep a job. But anyway, you got to know what you got to know which wall your ladder's leaning on, and that'll help you determine whether to stay in the fight or then stay in the chair.
And Dr. Hinojosa, I'm so glad.
I think he said that best. I know I can't weigh in the way that he just did, because he's got that experience, those 150 years that you mentioned of experience. Y'all know most of them are his, right? But I would just add to it that political capital has to be earned, and you earn that through your credibility. And I think one of the reasons that Michael has such credibility is because he has been doing the work, and he's so well known within the community and well respected within the community. So having that political capital is a given for him.
And I think I didn't mention this about you, Dr. Hinojosa, but in 2019, you were like Dallas's most favorite political public official in Dallas, right? To think of the superintendent as the public official and get that. I think that speaks volumes about the worth you have in that community versus somebody new trying to do something that could get them fired the next day or create chaos. There's a value that you have that you bring to Dallas historically, right? From being a student, a teacher, and longtime superintendent. Dr. Eggchain, you want to weigh in on that before I move to my next question?
All I can say is I want to be Michael one day. I do think it's important to know who's going to support you. And I think if you do spend a lot of time with parties in the community trying to explain why, the why is really important. And then you're able to solicit support for what has to be done for children. It is an investment in time, and you are the one who has to invest that time and reach out, not necessarily with those who agree with you, but be able to meet them at the table to have those conversations. And not be afraid to give up the position you're in. It is a very strong position when you are at a certain place in your experience where losing you is more of a loss to the community than you walking away. And that makes a big difference.
Thank you. So I'll ask my next question. What is the most effective way that you have found to bring people together around the return of school issue? Because as we listen to what's going on across the country, people are divided about coming to school, teacher unions, administrators, parents. So what have been some of your successes to bring people together?
Well, I think for us, it was we never were not together. Throughout the past year and a half, and even prior to that, we had regular engagement with our community. And so it was not contrived when we were pulling people together over the last year and a half and in the last few months as we prepared to reopen schools for this year. It was just an extension and more of the same. We do what we call chat and chew, and I used to do them live where we would eat and chat. And during the pandemic, all we did was make the shift to that being virtual. And the same thing goes for the lunch and learns that I had with my scholars during pre-pandemic, where I would go to the lunchroom and we would sit and we would talk. We did that virtually during the pandemic, and the same with my chats with teachers and with community supporters and leaders. So I think the key is to just be consistent in your communication all the time, and that way, whether it's returning to school or some other controversial issue, you're not going to have to try to find a way to communicate. You just use the channels that you've already developed and keep the communication going. And that's what's worked for us. When we had to make the shift last year to remote learning, we made some strategic priorities. We didn't completely throw out our strategic plan, but we readjusted our strategic priorities. And our first priority was to stay connected. And we defined what that meant for us and what it would take for us to do that during the midst of the pandemic, and especially at the beginning of the pandemic. Because if you all recall, March of last year, none of us would have expected that fast forward, nearly a year and a half, that we would still be wearing masks and fighting over what to do or not to do in terms of schooling. It was still very new and very fresh, but what we knew for sure is that we needed to stay in contact and closely connected with our families, with our teachers and leaders, and with our entire community. And so I think the best strategy is to prevent it by not having to create something new in the first place. We have a strong communication plan, and granted, we had to make some changes with it because of the pivot to all things virtual and because of the type of communication that we were doing. But pre-pandemic, when we had our YouTube channel and I had a talk show that I was doing and shifting it to a podcast and all of that, and so we just were able to use those same channels, and we were already doing surveys routinely with families and with our scholars to engage their opinion and making sure that their voices were being heard. So the best advice I would give is to just make sure you've got those strong communication avenues and strategies in place so that when something comes about that's unprecedented, whether it's a pandemic or something else that's just unique to your specific community, you'll be ready to address it through channels that you already have developed.
In addition to everything that Davis mentioned, I think it's really important to share with the larger community that this is an opportunity for innovation, and trying new things is something that will make our community stronger. So we went from remote to distance learning to hybrid to facilitated learning centers to now the return. And for those who did not feel schools were the safest places, it was our ability to communicate why it was the safest place in the community for the majority of our students, and eliminating concerns and for safety, and really resourcing our schools at capacity to make sure that we hadn't missed a beat of what could be offered to make our schools safer for our students and for the adults. That has been important. And I think having a superintendent's parent advisory, staying close contact with the PTA groups, with the foundations, with the city, and moving in the same direction, that schools are the safest places for our children, has proven itself to be effective.
Yeah, I'm not going to repeat some of the great ideas that have been laid out. I think part of it, though, is you got to let everybody know what's at stake. For 5% of our students, online learning was okay, but for 95%, it wasn't. And so if we can't get any further behind, and then if you model the behavior that you want and you're out there and accessible, it shows that you're not fair. And people don't want a whiner. They want a leader. They want a problem solver. And so every problem that they've thrown at us, my team has put together a solution so that we can come back safely. And, I don't dodge the media. I take all of their questions, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And part of that, and I tell especially the Latino community in the last several years has been under fire. Under the previous administration, a lot of people were getting ready. We have 47% English learners. We have more English learners than San Antonio has students, than El Paso has students. And I would have to go on TV on Telemundo and Univision and tell the parents not to panic. Same thing here, don't panic. I'll tell you when it's time to panic. Put your mask on, get your vaccine, come to school. We need you in person. And so you have to put your human capital on the line so that people will step up and do what's important for their students, for their kids. Thank you.
Thank you for those answers.
Building, I'm going to go back and jump ahead a little, looking at our time. And just one of the things that you talked about with some of the political realities, and Mike, we definitely don't want to see you in stripes, but I'm going to ask you, can you each address how you're dealing with the school board members and how they're also taking kind of relentless criticism, not only about the return to school, but also the DEI work that you all have initiated in your districts. Can you talk about how you're managing that relationship with them and helping them be good members of the governance team during this time? We'll start with you, Dr. Williams.
Yeah, and I think the key to that is very similar to what I said about just communicating in general. It's just having a solid communication plan. And one thing that we have learned during the last year and a half is how important clear talking points can be so that we can all be on the same page. And one thing that we do is we do what we call a before action plan as well as an after action plan. And a before action plan is just really a condensed version of a SWOT analysis. So basically we just ask the question, what's the worst that could happen, right? And we really address it through the lens of, if these things were to happen, here is how we would address it. And I do that, with my board, if there's ever a situation to where we've got something specific coming up that we know would be a hot button issue that they may have to address, because when they're out, and especially pre-pandemic, not as much now, but if they're out in Walmart or somewhere else and a constituent comes and asks them a question, I need for them to feel confident in what they're saying and for it not to be different than what I would say, one of my team members would say, or what another board member would say. And so we're really big on talking points. And one thing that I do as a leader is really try to work on being overly clear. And what I tell my team is that sometimes that means that repetition is necessary. Sometimes you're saying the same things over and over, and you're finding different ways to say the same things over and over, just for the point of clarity in terms of what you're trying to drive home. But as it relates to the board, relationships, that's key. And then just knowing how they communicate best, how do they want, for you to address them in terms of issues that are coming up. I have 5 very unique personalities within my board. My board president is a male and the other 4 are females. And I do not envy his position, but it just makes for, sometimes, dodging bullets within either one of them at any given time, depending on how they feel about a certain issue, but also having developed the relationship with each of them as individuals so that I know how to approach them in the event that they do get hit. Because, you can be as careful and as comprehensive and as detailed as possible, and there will still be times when something may catch you off guard or catch one of your board members off guard. And I think that relationship that's developed with them becomes your buffer, so that even if something happens, they know that your intent was there to ensure that they were well prepared, even if something happened where that wasn't necessarily the case. So just making sure that you understand how they want to be communicated with, and you value their communication style, including the amount of communication that they want, and making sure that those relationships remain solid. I'm at a point now where my board members are like, just text us. And so we have a group text thread. And of course, you have to be careful what you put in a text, but for just some short, quick communication, a quick text to them is sometimes all that they need. And they all know that at any point they can pick up the phone and call me, and I can go deeper or more detailed on any issue of concern.
Great advice, because we definitely want all of you to be in your positions for a long time. So I'm going to move it over to you, Vivian.
And I'll be very brief considering the amount of time we have left. Obviously, relationships matter dramatically. I think the conversation around, let's focus on what we can control versus what we can't control. And so there'll be always differences of opinion on how we should be doing our work. But if we continue to focus on what's best for our youth, then the decisions are so much easier to be made at the board meeting. And of course, briefing in advance of what may be coming our way so that they're not surprised or shocked or find themselves not having the responses necessary to be credible in the larger community matters, which takes a lot of time because there's significant differentiation based on how many years a person has been on the board and what their perspective is on the role of the superintendent, and really leveling the playing field for information so that all board members receive the same information and do not feel that some are receive more than others. And having constant explorations of what is the root cause as to why this is happening. So the email that you have received that has upset you really doesn't have anything to do with the topic that's being discussed in the email, but it's really about something else that may have happened a while back that is surfacing from this individual. So knowing our audience and being on the same page, and always knowing that our board members are our dream team that we are privileged to work with.
I
Yeah,
love
well,
that. Dream
yeah,
team. Mike.
I've had a lot of experience working with boards in many different contexts. And, sometimes you just got to protect the board. Like on this matter, I said, look, um, whether how we operate schools, that's a day-to-day decision. That's my call. So if it goes bad, I'll take all the blame. And you take the blame when something goes wrong, and you give them the credit when things go well. And they're elected officials. I'm not. They appointed me. We also have this protocol. I have a great team. I have the former Denver superintendent that's on as my deputy. And so, I have, and in fact, at one time I had four former superintendents on my senior team. And so I use distributive leadership, and I delegate, and I have them call board members, and the board members can always call me. But they all know that if it's bad news, I can't delegate bad news. I'm the one. I call all 9 of them. And by the way, I got the mod squad, 3 black, 3 white, 3 brown, and they don't always like each other. But they do appreciate that when it's bad news, they're going to hear from Big Papa directly. They're not going to hear this. They're not going to hear from somebody else. And therefore, now they know they can brace themselves, and then they've all supported me on this. Now, even though they don't agree with each other on a lot of things, they were unanimous on our racial equity initiative, policy, staffing, everything we've done. So they are united on that issue. And they're pretty united on this mask issue too. And so, but you also, sometimes we want to blame the board for our mistakes. The one mistake I did make at the beginning of the pandemic is that, I was getting interviewed on CNN and MSNBC and Fox, and I was making decisions in real time. And I have this in AASA-ism. Command decisions are easy to make and hard to implement. Consensus decisions are messy. They take a long time, and implementation is much faster. But when you're in a crisis, you don't have time to call a committee. You got to make a decision. And so I moved too fast. And so some of them got upset with me. So it took me a little while to calm that down. But if that's the consequence, you're going to be mad at me? Okay. But I got to make a decision that's in the best interest of the district. And so, and you just learn how to read your board, and you learn to have your team help you read your board, because there's so much coming at you so fast that you have to be able to have those systems in place to manage them. So you try to protect them wherever you can, and then give them some cover, and then just do what's in the best interest of the students.
Great words of wisdom from 3 successful superintendents. Tracy, I'm thinking that maybe we should open for a couple of questions from the audience. What do you think? You're muted.
I wanted to ask a question that was in the chat. I love that Dr. Hinojosa goes from being Isley Brothers to Big Papa in 20 minutes, but we spanned some decades there, group. But there is a question in the thread from Michael, and he says, we talk about there's been a high turnover across the nation in superintendents, whether it's board related or superintendents decide, hey, I'm throwing my hands up, like this is too much. The question we have posed is, how do you navigate the politics of your district and community with your equity lens? The current climate is pretty aggressive for superintendents who are talking about equity and ethnic studies, and I know how that can be. So what are you all doing to navigate that work? And Michael, if I did not ask your question correctly, you are more than willing to chime in.
Well, I will say for us, I think for me, the main thing is knowing your community. I mentioned before, I'm in Alabama, which could not be more red. And our state school board passed the anti-critical race theory thing, the resolution, I think about a week ago, which was really far reaching. It was actually more far reaching than I expected it to be. And it passed with 2 of the state board members, including my state board member, opposing it. But you just have to know your community, and you have to involve your community. And I love what Vivian said earlier about making sure you have the scholars' voices as part of that. And then use data, let some of the data do the work for you. When you are able to show the need for that work through real-time data within your district, I think it speaks volumes. At the end of the day, you're not going to convince some people. I mean, when you're talking about issues like this, they run so much deeper than what is actually being said. And one of my favorite quotes, in full transparency, I got it from Criminal Minds, how to do the quotes at the beginning. But for those who believe, no proof is necessary. For those who do not, no proof is possible. And so just know that you can talk until you're blue in the face, and there will be people that will never see things through the lens that you do when it comes to issues around race and racism and social justice and equity and DEI and all of that. And we still have to do what's right. We still have to have the courage to do what's right. But we do have to do that through the lens of understanding what our community expects of us and what our community needs, and then establishing just some high quality data points that you can use to support what you're doing.
I think sometimes you have to revisit your strategy. So you can put an incredible plan together and then realize that if you don't build on the strengths of your community, even though you don't agree with all your community members, they will make it their business to prevent you from moving the agenda for students. So we're all at different levels of understanding, but driving equity through the lens of inclusivity is the first phase that we have used in our system, so that there isn't this fear of if we differentiate by resourcing certain individuals or schools or groups more, that means we're taking something away from you. And that is a clear misunderstanding that can occur. So being inclusive and really demonstrating the patience necessary to bring everyone along. And also then recognizing that it's not always implicit bias, but it's explicit. So knowing who is going to be working against this effort is just as important as it is for those that support the work together for us to create a better environment for our students that ultimately leads to better learning.
Yeah, I would like to build on that. You got to know your community, as David said, and now I know my community because I've been here for a long time, been other places too, to learn from other people. But what's really startling is that I have the spreadsheet of all the districts in the country that I keep up with. At one time, a few months ago, 8 of the 15 largest districts in the country did not have a superintendent. New York, LA, Chicago, and then even the ones of the other ones, they had less than 3 years of experience. It's only Alberto and myself who've been around in a large urban, and Bill Haidt in Philly, and a few others, and Barbara and Orlando. But if you look at it, the turnover has been huge. And then I saw some stories and how Alvin Wilbanks went out was so heartbreaking. I mean, you see all that vitriol and volatility, and it's really tough to hang in there. But well, I was accused of talking about the Isley Brothers and Big Papa. Now I'm going to talk about Drake. But we're doing God's plan, so we got to do it. We got to do it right.
I love you, Mike.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I'm going to throw, we're coming to the end here, but I'm going to have one question. It was in the chat, and it was also one we wanted to ask you, and you can be brief with this one, and then we'll do some concluding remarks for the day's program. But the question is, how are you taking care of yourself? We just heard Mike talk about all the people who are leaving. They're just the relentless pressure that people are under. How are you making sure you're there for the long haul? Avis.
Yeah, so self-care matters. You have to have a tribe. One of my tribe members is part of your cohort, Bryn Elliott. I think she has her camera off because she's acting like she's working or whatnot. But you have to have a tribe, and you have to have people on your team and be able to know that there's a time and a place to do work, and there's a time and a place to take care of yourself. I work hard, but I play hard as well. I'm also a runner, and I also drink wine. And you have to find the balance of that work for you. Stay prayed up and stay connected and practice mindfulness, because it really does matter, and it really does make a difference. And you cannot lead your team if you don't take care of yourself.
Thank you. Beautifully stated. Vivian.
Family, friends, staying active, reading a lot. Being able to read takes me to another place. So when I come back, I feel refreshed. I feel like I'm Michael Fullen's friend, or I just wrote the book, 5 Practices for Equity-Focused School Leadership. Being able to escape to someplace else so that when you come back, you're recharged is important. And having mentors like Maria.
Thank you, Vivian. Proud to be your mentor. Mike.
Well, it's a little different for me because I don't have any friends. All my friends are dead. So I don't, and to me, I don't get stressed. I give stress. I'm a carrier. So I really don't, people say, how do you sleep at night? And I said, I sleep great. I sleep just like a baby. I wake up every 3 hours crying, and then I hit the bottle and I go back to sleep. So I'm good.
There comes a time for all of you younger superintendents, there comes a time where you can speak the truth, like you just heard from Mike. It's a special place to be when you have options because where your career has led you. So let me thank all 3 of our amazing panelists. We just are so appreciative of you taking time to share your wisdom, your experiences with everyone that's coming into the new cohort and those who have been in former cohorts and still out there doing the work. So round of applause, please, for our amazing panelists.